Welcome to the AFGHANEYE YouTube channel. If this is your first visit, make sure to subscribe and press the notification bell so that you won't miss any of our new videos.
What about now? So there was no audio. Just sorry, give me a second, guys. This is my first time hosting a show myself, so just bear with me for about a minute, 2 minutes for this show as I make sure I get everything done correctly.
And Ahmed-Jan, it's the Department for International Development. Just
the Department for International Development. Sure.
FYI.
FYI.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so sorry about that, everyone. So I'm going to make sure that that is shortened. So today's guest is Sippi Azarbaijani-Moghaddam. Make sure you like the video. And if this is your first time coming onto our channel, please do make sure that you subscribe. Press the notification bar so you don't miss any of our content as it comes out. And now we're coming back to today's esteemed guest, who is Sippi Azarbaijani-Moghaddam. And as the thumbnail suggests, we're going to be talking about aid in Afghanistan, which is especially pertinent given the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding before us. And let me just introduce our guest very briefly before I ask her to introduce herself. So Sippi is a social scientist, consultant, and part-time PhD candidate at the University of St. Andrews, where she's researching Taliban identity. She's worked in Afghanistan since 1995, which is when I was born, with a range of organizations, including the EU, the World Bank, the Department for International Development, the UN, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the NATO International Security Assistance Force, also known as ISAF. She holds a BA in Persian and Old Iranian from the University of Oxford, a master's in rural development sociology from the University of Birmingham, and a diploma in anthropology from the University of Aberdeen. Now, Sippi, khosh aamadi to the AFGHANEYE live stream podcast. Today's is a live stream, so we're live, but this is essentially going to be a sort of in the podcast sort of format. And so I want to ask you, obviously I've given this sort of pretty elaborate introduction of you, but I want to ask you to sort of introduce yourself. Who is Sippi? How did she get involved in Afghanistan? What motivated you to start working in Afghanistan? And yeah, if you could just walk us through that.
So it's actually a really interesting story of how I got involved with Afghanistan. I'm Iranian, obviously from the surname you can tell that I was born in Iran, and this was during the time of the Shah. And my father was a bit of a sort of explorer, traveler. So he decided to go to Afghanistan with my sister dressed as a boy. I don't understand that part, but he took my 14-year-old sister dressed as a boy, and off they went, and they had an absolutely amazing time. This was Afghanistan in the 70s, hippie trail, all of that. They had an astonishing time. I was very small at that time. And when they came back, the whole thing with their stories, Ahmed-waleed cassettes, I heard the whole Zim Zim sort of song, all of this stuff. All
Layla
the
had heard it before long as well.
Well, there you go. No, she heard it a lot later than I did. Sort of very beautiful chapan silk, even like an embroidered Turkmen hat that someone had given my father from me. All of this, it was very captivating. And I have to say that I was immediately captivated. And bizarrely, it just stayed with me. And so 1978, by that time, we'd moved to the UK. And there was the Saur Revolution. And my father was really upset. I remember that day we were at that stage, we were living in Birmingham. And my father was so upset when he heard everything that had happened. And, somehow it all sort of got transferred to me. So I was sort of following Afghanistan from this very, very early age. And so by the time I got to Oxford, there were people who were actually going off to work in Afghanistan. And I was really keen to go, but every time I applied, people would say, no, you can't come because you don't have any transferable skills, and we need very transferable skills. So I had to wait until I got my master's in rural development, and then I went. I even tried to go from Tajikistan. At one stage I was in Tajikistan in '93 during the Civil War, and I met the Afghan consul, lovely man, got the visa, about to cross the border, and good old Abdul Rashid Dostum decides to attack the border posts in Tajikistan. They shut down the whole thing, and hostilities started, and then all these crazy Russians turned up, etc. It was a big mess, so I couldn't go. But I waved at a lot of people in Afghanistan across the river, and that's as far as I got. But I finally got there in 1995, and I went to Faizabad in Badakhshan.
Okay, just before I continue, do you potentially have any headphones, because your audio is there's sort of a scratching sound?
How about now?
Can you just say a couple of things?
Would you like me to say, I don't know?
Yeah, it's still there. It's still
could be my voice.
No, it's not your voice. It's like there's sort of a scratching sort of noise when you're talking.
I don't have any headphones nearby anywhere. Where do I have headphones? Hold on 1 second.
Sure.
Let's see if I can. I'd have these big black headphones, it's going to look really weird.
That's fine. I mean, if it's fine by me, I hope it's fine by you.
And now it's going to be, and now Princess Leia. Let's try these. So how about now?
Can you talk slightly, or?
Hold on, I've just got to sort of get them activated so I can hear you. Okay, so how's this?
I can still hear it if I'm honest, but it's slightly sort of let me just check what the YouTube live chat is saying. Sure, that's fine. In any case, I think that's fine. So you got to Faizabad in 1995. Now, how was that, given that that was sort of the height of the Afghan sort of civil war between the different Mujahideen parties? The Taliban at that point had obviously not captured Kabul yet, but how was Faizabad and the situation in general by the time you arrived from a humanitarian or aid perspective in 1995?
Faizabad, sorry, I'm just going to remove one ear because I can't hear myself speaking. Faizabad was very underdeveloped and poor. There were lots of minor commanders regularly fighting each other outside Faizabad, not so much in Faizabad. The population was not really happy with the commanders. There were a lot of quiet atrocities, shall we say, like away from the sort of public gaze. All the women in public had to wear burqas. it was quite, it was very conservative. It was not a great place to live, but it was relatively peaceful compared to other places, except when fighting would break out between specific commanders. So it was a challenging place to work. It wasn't, for instance, I went to work for a sort of rehabilitation NGO, and it was all sort of people who'd come from the eastern provinces to work in Faizabad for this NGO. No female staff. At that stage, there was very minimal number of female staff, and we weren't allowed to have any females in our office, like visiting from the local population or working for us. So it was extremely conservative and challenging. And, so basically, like, we lived in a building. We didn't have any form of bathroom. We had a drop pit latrine. We didn't have any washing facilities per se. We had a room with a water tank and a bucket. And we didn't have furniture. We didn't have computers. Pretty much everything was done by hand with pen and paper and mattresses, and that was it. And from that, actually, this NGO was doing a lot of good rural development work.
I see. And so I think it's interesting. I mean, it's not interesting, but it is interesting given the way the conversation has had. The fact that you mentioned Faizabad, the women were wearing burqas, and it was really conservative, because if you've been following the news over the last 1 or 2 decades, as I'm sure you have been, you would think that it's only in the south and in the east where people are conservative, and burqas only existed because of the Taliban. But here, and I'm assuming that Faizabad was at this point basically under the control of Jamiyat, right?
Shura Nazar, yes.
Yeah, Shura Nazar.
Rabbani.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so you obviously you arrived in Afghanistan in 1995, but these are sort of the years as we're progressing through the late 90s where the Taliban's control of the country is starting to expand. And whilst they never took Badakhshan in the 90s, they have taken it now, of course. But whilst they never did you ever actually come in contact or encounter the Taliban at that point?
Not in 95, but obviously from 96 onwards. And 97, I actually specifically chose to go and work in Taliban-controlled areas because I wanted to
Which
interact
areas are we
with them.
talking about?
So I went to work in Nangarhar, Laghman, Logar, Paktia, Ghazni. Where else did I go? Herat, Mazar. At this stage, they'd taken all of these areas. Bamiyan, obviously Hazarajat was under this sort of embargo. Wardak, Kabul itself. So all of these provinces.
And how was that? I mean, comparing and contrasting it with Shura Nazar as an aid worker.
It was fine, actually. It was fine because obviously I cut my teeth sort of negotiating with Mujahideen commanders, because we very often had to negotiate with Mujahideen commanders to go into certain areas, to distribute certain items, to access roads, to make sure also that we didn't get stuck in crossfire. So it was a habit that had already formed for me. But my specific interest was to take women to work in the eastern provinces. So to take the women cross-border from Peshawar to work in the eastern provinces. So I was
sorry to interject. What kind of work? What kind of work are we talking about?
So, for example, I was at that stage working with a water and sanitation, primarily water and sanitation NGO, but we also built schools, and we also helped with building or reconstructing housing for returnees. We had other types of construction projects. We also had agriculture projects. So I can tell you, I can bore you about the agriculture projects, but my specific sort of interest in taking women to talk to women about the water and sanitation was that transporting water from the source to the house was the job of the women. So our aim was to make sure that the wells were in the right place and also at a good distance for the women. But all the work was being done by men talking to men. So when I arrived in this NGO, I said, no, no, we have to have women talking to women. And I was told, you can't take women because the Taliban are in Afghanistan. And I said, no, I will take women. So I went and spoke to the security commander in the Eastern Zone, and I got the permits from him. Then I went and
Do you
spoke to
remember
Vice
his name?
Virtue. I can't remember his name. I
Okay.
wish I could remember his name. I'm sure I can find his name. But
Mhm.
anyway, and I wish I'd kept the permit. So basically with that, and having to then liaise with Vice and Virtue and the district governors in each of the areas where we worked, we just took one permit to the next place, to the next place, to the next place, and we just expanded our area of operations with women across eastern Afghanistan. And it was fine. There was absolutely no issue. And another NGO that I worked with, and I remember the Taliban had, I think a new group of Taliban had just arrived in Gardiz, and they were from Badakhshan. So I wanted to see them because obviously I'd spent this time in Badakhshan. So I went to see them, and they were from Baharak mostly. They were from, madrasa educated people from Baharak, and we discussed, like their villages in Badakhshan, etc. And they actually asked me for women's projects. They said, why aren't you doing women projects with women for health? Why aren't you doing, sort of small income generation? And I said, well, like at the moment, the NGO doesn't have that in its programs, but we'll take note. So I had a very different interaction with the Taliban on women's projects.
So you'd say that on balance, it was easier. Ironically, it was easier working with them than with the Shura-i-Nizar commanders.
Sometimes, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it depended on the character of the personalities
Of course,
involved.
it's a people's
sometimes,
kind of organization.
yeah,
It's people-oriented work.
because some Taliban governors were just interested in fighting. They weren't interested in development for the local people, etc. So the ones that were more development-minded were very open to having women's projects. Of course, as long as it was all within the bounds of their interpretation of Islam.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
So when we're talking about the Taliban, and obviously there's the discussion about have they changed or have they not changed. But before I pose that question to you, so during the last 20 years with with the Karzai and the Ghani regimes, were you in Afghanistan consistently, or was it sort of stints that lasted varying durations of time?
It was stints, but some stints would last, kind of around a year, and then some would be sort of, shorter and longer, depending on projects and depending on what I had to do. I was sort of based in Afghanistan at different times. I had a house in Kabul and so on and so forth, but it varied.
Okay.
But, even if I was outside, I was still interacting with what was going on in Afghanistan. So I have never really left.
I see. So what was it like working with them over the last sort of 20 years, especially sort of in the latter period? So we're talking, your 2015, 16, 17. Would you say that, because there were obviously reports and we heard of these intelligence gatherings of aid workers being killed, of civilian workers of the government being killed. So there obviously was that aspect of danger to it. What was your sort of, I mean, I understand, of course, that this is people, you're working with people and organizations, and there's a diversity sort of experience here. But I'm sort of interested in gaining your sort of personal experience. What was it, with all of that danger that in mind, what was it like working within this sort of rather turbulent, tumultuous period?
It was very clear that the situation was becoming more and more dangerous for expatriates, and also for NGO workers and for government workers, but for different reasons. And there was the rise of criminality and kidnapping by criminals, So criminality was becoming an issue, as well as Taliban, ISIS, and other different groups. And the sort of area that we could work was shrinking. The area where we could move was shrinking. So let's say that under the Taliban, I pretty much got in a car with the driver and went anywhere I wanted to go. Okay. No halts. any time of the day, get in the car and just drive. And then, like for a brief period after the fall of the Taliban, you could still do this. But very, very quickly, the old commanders from different factions came in. Their men were transferred into the ANA and the ANP, the police and the army. And so suddenly you had, checkpoints who would harass you, who would bother you. And then,
So I'm assuming this was around the 2003-4 sort of period.
I noticed it from about 2005-6.
Okay.
And then, you had people who were, okay, I didn't have problems with this, but other people who reported it, they would be kidnapped or bothered or killed or harassed by people. And you wouldn't know if they were Taliban, if they were criminals, sort of posing as the Taliban, if they were somebody else. So I think, because people don't carry ID cards, it was very difficult to know
and
who
everyone
they were.
has a beard and a turban, so everyone just sort of blends in, right?
Yeah. So, and then, the area shrank, and then even in Kabul, it started to shrink. But this was really alarming, because people were being picked up and kidnapped in different areas of Kabul.
And which year, I just sort of want to put a time, which year would you say this started to become a thing?
The year that it started to affect me, because obviously I'm telling you this from my personal viewpoint, was 2015. 2015, one of my friends was kidnapped. Okay. 2016, another friend was kidnapped. 2017, someone I'd heard of from another organization was kidnapped. So it just, all the time there was somebody who'd been kidnapped who was somebody you knew or a friend of somebody you knew. So the kidnapping became, very troublesome. And so really, the other thing was that you have to remember that, when you go to Afghanistan, you have to be insured. So whoever is employing you or you yourself have to insure yourself. So insurance companies increasingly were asking us for, sort of a security plan or to be with a security company. And the security company, for whatever reasons, they would say we have intelligence reports which indicate this or that, or to make life easier for themselves, limited everybody's movement. So the limitations were from actual external forces which made life difficult for everybody, and then also security companies trying to corral people to make life easier for themselves and to keep their clients safe.
I see. So so during the previous, I'm going to get to sort of working and being exposed to, let's say, the inner workings of the aid/government sort of, let's say, interaction. I'm going to get to that in a bit, but where were you primarily at least hoping to work or initially working when the Taliban sort of collapsed and the previous sort of government? Sounds like it's a bit of a tongue twister because I'm still getting used to it. But after 2001, where were you primarily sort of working? I mean, I know you mentioned Kabul as well and having a house there, but you also sort of mentioned driving around and not being bothered. So where were you primarily working?
There was no real primarily after 2001. It was very much based on whatever sort of contract I decided to take. So I was really free roaming, So I would say that probably I visited the majority of provinces in that period after 2001, but, sometimes with very, very bad security, like later on. So from about 2006, security in Kandahar started to be problematic. 2007, it was already problematic. But I was consistently going there to do different types of work. So, and, for many different reasons, right up until 2017, I was doing the me one car, one driver thing. And 2017 was the last year when I was allowed to do that by the people I was working for. Yeah. And that was in Samangan. So just to give you an idea of how much roaming there was.
Sure. So, in your interactions with the Taliban, speaking of 2017, which is relatively recent, would you say
Yeah.
they've changed? Because I have my own answer to this question. Everyone has their own answer. It's like controversial. Everyone gets really angry about it. But as someone who's sort of interacted with them firsthand over a period of 26 years, what's your take?
I'm going to answer this question in a slightly roundabout way. So if you said to me, aid workers, Afghan colleagues that you've had since 1995, have they changed? I would say absolutely. The younger generation are nothing like the generation I worked with in 1995. They have completely different goals, aspirations, experiences, and education. And I would say that probably the same shift has occurred within the Taliban. Perhaps less so, but I think that all the same, the experiences that they've had and the enemies that they've faced have created a different version of the Taliban.
What was it? Was it sort of like, I mean, I mentioned the fact that aid worker, I mean, the thing is that if you read some of these books that sort of study the evolution of the Taliban's sort of strategy as an insurgency, they kind of implicate the Taliban in killing civilian workers, in killing aid workers, at least in the initial periods, in order to sort of paralyze the government and the international coalition in those rural areas, to sort of strike fear, terror, and to essentially move in to fill the vacuum. Now, Alhamdulillah, seems like nothing of the sort happened to you, but in terms of death threats from the Taliban, unless you could tell us that did happen. But there's obviously a level of trust involved based on where you're going, which commander's sort of territory you're venturing into. Can you tell us more about that in terms of going into sort of no man's land and having to actually interact with them as insurgents, knowing that there was sort of a fear and a stigma attached to it?
Which period are you talking about?
Any period, to be, I mean, I would preferably go for the latter periods, but even in the 2000,
Yeah.
you mentioned Kandahar in 2006, and that's obviously where battles actually started to happen between Canadian troops in Panjwai and the Taliban, right? But if you were traveling around then you've obviously sort of got a level of understanding with whoever's operational there. So how does one go about doing that in a war zone, so to speak?
I don't like to say. Actually, I'm not going to say.
Okay, sure.
But there are ways and means. And just as an anecdote of the attacks on Panjwai from the Canadians, Operation Medusa, at that time I was contacting civil society in Kandahar and trying to get an idea of, where civil society was at with trying to negotiate some sort of peace. And it was absolutely horrendous. Late at night, these helicopters literally like thundering over Kandahar, and you'd wake up and the noise was just, I mean, it was just horrendous just hearing the helicopters fly overhead. I don't want to think what it was like for the people of Panjwai, So that's just an anecdote. But there are ways and means, and let's just say that there are ways and means. And in terms of, who gets killed and why, it's really case specific. I think that, it's difficult to generalize. And whenever people said, this happened to this person, I would say, look at the details of the case, because it's never what people say it is. And people were very, very quick to just label everything Taliban. And later, especially lately, again, going back to an anecdote from 1998, which was the first time that I remember a bomb exploding in one of the ditches outside the Pakistan embassy. And I remember asking one of my Afghan friends who was sort of very close to the Taliban, and I said, well, what is this? Who's put the bomb? And he said, no, if you want to be known as an important person, put a bomb outside your own house. And I thought this was a really strange thing to say. But in many ways, I almost feel like people almost stage attacks, or if somebody else attacks them, they now say, oh, it's the Taliban, to make themselves like a target. I'm a target of the Taliban, I'm so important. So it's kind of, it's very, very complicated. And I think every time somebody's attacked, if someone says, oh, it's the Taliban, go and do your homework, go and check it out. So for example, if you remember the attack on the maternity hospital and the attack on the girls' school recently, we were told Taliban or Haqqani. That's how it was painted before they turned up. Now they turned up and we're being told, oh, those ISIS attacks. And I'm thinking, well, so why didn't you say there were ISIS attacks back then? Why are you telling us that it was ISIS now? So what's going on? So there's a lot of shenanigans with the reporting of attacks and who's killed who.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point as well, and I think this goes to a lot of people in the previous government as well, who all activists in the sense of people that like to refer to themselves as activists in the sense of sort of using the fact that the Taliban have attacked them, or like you said, potentially misconstruing an event in order to paint sort of themselves as being victims of the Taliban or champions of whichever human rights sort of values. And I think that's something that the previous regime especially was, it had a lot of people working within it and associated with it, that were basically, they made political and indeed financial capital off of that. And so now I want to move the conversation less away from the Taliban, more towards sort of the previous government that collapsed over the last 20 years. And who better to talk to than someone who was there sort of watching it unfold year by year. So, as an aid worker, so you've worked within, let's say, the aid industry, and that industry's obviously come to be massively criticized, especially because we're now confronted with this humanitarian crisis. And a lot of the time, I remember before the capital fell and we had the Islamic Emirate 2.0, a lot of times we'd be like, look, like this whole economic system is underpinned by aid and reliance on donations, and once those dry up, things are going to look very bad. Now, as an insider, right, it's one thing for us on the outside to just sort of stitch together a picture and a basic understanding of this is going to end badly. What was it like on the inside? What would you say the attitude, first of all, of the government was towards sort of aid, international donors? What would you say the attitudes of international donors themselves were? How would you sort of characterize each one of those being problematic, or perhaps any misunderstandings? I know I asked a very really loaded question, but let's start off with the government. Okay, what would you say from your personal observations, liaisons with officials, was the government sort of understanding, or officials, the understanding of officials within the government towards international aid?
Again, I think that it would have shifted period by period, because at first there was literally a bonanza. I mean, literally people were throwing money at Afghanistan, yeah? And then, it became even more of a bonanza once the military set up the provincial reconstruction teams. And, all the commanders of the US military had their own funds that they could use to win hearts and minds. So then you had even more money being thrown at the situation. So you had this sort of crescendo of money being thrown at the situation. And then it started to decline for many different reasons, because the military knew it was going to pull out, and also donor fatigue. So I think that, the government got used to having lots of money thrown at it and not too much, people checking where the money was going. And this slowly started to shift, but I don't think that, people in the ministries, etc., wanted to accept that it was over. They wanted to continue to believe that, money was going to just continue to flood into Afghanistan. And the other thing was that I think one of the difficult, let's say, activities between government and donors, or in governments and money, was the relationship with the Ministry of Finance. Now, I'm going to put my hands up and say I'm not a finance person, and I didn't work with the Ministry of Finance. But in a number of situations, interacting with other ministries, discussing budgeting and then getting the money from the Ministry of Finance, it was very difficult and very arbitrary. So it was much easier to get the money from donors directly, rather than to go through the long and arduous and painful task of trying to rip it out of the Ministry of Finance. So, and then, the other challenge was, and this was a long discussion of decentralization and getting the money from the center out to the provinces. So this was a big challenge for a lot of ministries, for governors, and so on and so forth, because again, during the bonanza, the governors had access to all of this money, and then later they didn't, or less so. So then, and then the other thing is that, of course, you must have heard these rumors as well, that every sort of, let's say, high level kind of, or certain level position in Afghanistan had a price tag attached. So when those people went into that position, then they had to recover the funds. And so, with the decline of donor money, then I think that all of these people had to become a lot more predatory towards the population. So very, very complex. The money picture was very complex. And, I don't know, I've just touched on sort of one brief angle. Yeah.
So which ministries were you working with? You mentioned that you weren't working with the Ministry of Finance. So which were the other ones?
Well, I spent some time working with the Ministry of Rural Rehabilitation and Development. I spent a very short period of time working with the Ministry of Women's Affairs. I spent quite a bit of time working, evaluating a large program inside the Ministry of Interior. Recently, I was working with the Ministry of Martyrs and Disabled, the newly formed. At one stage, I worked again briefly with the Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs. At that time, it had Martyrs and Disabled attached as well. So once again, I was working with the Martyrs and Disabled bit. Who else? I've had interactions with the Ministry of Public Health. I'm just trying to think what other ministries there are.
We had quite a few ministries, but
yeah, I did.
There was a question that I wanted to lead on to, and I think something you just mentioned sort of connects it to my question very well. My question was, what would you say the priorities or the shortcomings of donors were in terms of their priorities? But you also mentioned the Ministry of Women's Affairs, right? Which is obvious. Oh, okay. Well, what was working with the Ministry of Women's Affairs and acting almost as an interlocutor between international donors who obviously place a very high priority on women's rights in Afghanistan, and on the other hand, the ministry that was dedicated towards the uplifting of Afghan women? What was that like? What would you say the shortcut? Because we can now say there were shortcomings present because the whole structure sort of collapsed, and now the Ministry of Women's Affairs is Ministry of Vice and Virtue. What were the shortcomings in terms of the approach of the internationals, so to speak, towards, women's affairs, the ministry itself?
What do you mean by what were the shortcomings? Because this is a very complicated question and an interesting one.
It's a complicated question, but essentially sort of I was going to ask what were the priorities of international donors, but then you mentioned women's affairs, which is obviously going to be priority for them. But sort of what was their, I guess shortcomings is a loaded way of asking it, but what was their sort of outlook in terms of what they were trying to achieve and where perhaps they didn't achieve that stated goal in terms of women's affairs?
It's a really, I think that it's something worth actually writing about. So I would say that, again, this changed from period to period. So let's say, for instance, when Sima Samar first came in and the ministry was set up, bizarrely, very bizarrely, in my sort of interactions with her in that early period, the focus was very much on things like what should the girls' school uniform look like? Should there be headscarves or should there not be headscarves? And I was thinking,
On which side of the spectrum was she on?
she was, of course, like take the headscarves off, have a more modern uniform. And I was thinking, is this really a priority right now? The country is just about to collapse. There's drought. Like a very strategic decision has been made to hand over a ministry. You now have to negotiate, women's political space in this country against very, very difficult odds. School uniform is not a priority right now. But anyway, so I mean, that was that. And then it was a very high profile position at first, okay? But then with the decline of donor funding towards the ministry, because it simply couldn't function the way I think donors had hoped, the position became more of a bargaining chip, like how the ministries were divided between different ethnic groups. So this was specifically sort of handed over to specific ethnic groups to fill the sort of positions, ministerial, the quota, the sort of ministerial position quotas. So it became part of that bargaining process. And then by that stage also, the ministers were interested in attracting funding because, attracting projects and funding gave you as an individual in your own sort of community a certain, amount of power and possibility. So that whole process was going on. The difficulty for the Ministry of Women's Affairs was that, if you think about it, the mentality of the majority of Afghans at that time was you get project funding, you implement a project, people say thank you, because that's what the aid community had fostered. Like you come into a village, you say, what do you need? People say, we need an irrigation canal, you build it, and then you have a ceremony and everybody comes and says thank you. Okay, so that's the mentality. And then suddenly these people turn up and they're like, no, you're not doing that. You're not going to hand out anything to women. That's the responsibility of other ministries. You just do advocacy. And everybody was scratching their heads and like, what the hell is that? Nobody's going to say thank you for advocacy. What the hell is advocacy? So it was confusing for people. And I remember having a discussion with a female politician in Mazar. This was in 2002 after the fall of the Taliban. And I said, so what are you thinking? What are your strategies? And she was like, I want you to give me money so that I could go around to the women and at least just give each of them a bag of chocolates. And it was the handout thing, like every ministry wanted to have stuff to hand out. And I think that the difficulty for ministries like the Ministry of Women's Affairs and other ministries which were supposed to advocate on behalf of certain groups was that people wanted to see something concrete being handed out. They didn't care if they were advocating on behalf of some nebulous thing called rights, or some nebulous, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. It's beautiful, fantastic, very necessary. But if I'm someone who's living in a food insecure area, I don't care, So you mentioned
there are a number of things that you've touched on here. First of all, is the general sort of understanding being underpinned by handouts, epitomized by the chocolates, right? And I think that epitomizes itself sort of why we are where we are in terms of the humanitarian crisis that's ongoing. But you mentioned something else that's really interesting that I want to ask you about. You said that ministers would try to attract funding, right? Now, obviously, we know that's the case even in the UK where we are. Every minister likes funding, but of course, the funding comes from central government or Her Majesty's Treasury or the Exchequer, right? But in Afghanistan at this time, the funding is coming from international donors and aid. Now, what were ministers doing to attract this funding from these from the internationals, if we can call them that? What were the kinds of things that they were up to?
In order for a ministry to attract funding, you had to have a good track record in implementing, certain projects and programs. But the other thing is, remember that some of the funding was going into big central funds, so like the Afghan Reconstruction Trust Fund or the Law and Order Trust Fund for Afghanistan, and then it would be distributed as salaries, etc., to different ministries. And also quite a bit of funding would go into the Ministry of Finance, and then the ministries would have to create budgets and convince the Ministry of Finance to give them the money to spend. And this was always problematic because a lot of the ministries didn't have the capacity to write the budgets and the activities to get this money. So sometimes the money was just sitting there and then, wasn't spent. So going back to your question about what would ministers do, basically it was, you had to convince donors that you had the capacity to implement projects and programs that would have a good impact in areas that donors were interested in. So, for example, Ministry of Rural Rehabilitation and Development had really good track record in implementing impactful programs. And one of them being the National Solidarity Program, which later became the Citizens Charter. So, very complicated program. And a lot of moving parts, and very large sort of department dedicated to this at the Ministry of Rural Rehabilitation, but good results, at least on paper. So good results,
What does at least on paper mean?
It was a good program. It did have a good impact. It did it was implemented probably in all the provinces in Afghanistan. Some provinces would have been difficult to check. Some things were more on paper than in reality, I can attest. Certainly in relation to implementing with women. So, for example, I can say that, that was problematic. The other thing was that they also, like so many people across Afghanistan, struggled with elite capture. So, elites in provinces and districts capturing the project, putting their people in there, and, controlling the funds that were tied to the project. So that sort of thing. And, I think it's been discussed elsewhere. You've probably discussed it with people in other parts of your program. If you haven't, you should. The Afghan habit of always saying everything's great and it's fantastic and we're doing really well. I mean, everyone does that. It's not just the Afghans, but I think that it was very problematic, certainly, for Ashraf Ghani, because everybody was telling her it was all going so well, and I guess it wasn't. So
yeah, I mean, you mentioned once again women, and the thing with women is that in terms of it seemed, I mean, I can't speak from sort of a position of authority here, but from looking from the outside in, it seems that the women aspect always sort of plays a factor in terms of how generous people can be with their wallets. So when I asked you sort of one of the things that motivated donors, when I asked you about what ministers would do in order to get funding for their respective ministries, one of the things I was thinking about, and you mentioned Ashraf Ghani as well, was the women aspect of it. So, for example, we had a deputy defense minister who was a woman but didn't actually have any sort of military experience to speak of, right? And so that's but what would you, so now that we've sort of covered this sort of topic of what exactly motivates and how aid actually works. Well, now that we've somewhat covered it, what would you say were the failures of the sort of international aid community in terms of how they perceived Afghanistan or its problems? Because on the one hand, you have the government with misplaced priorities, for example, headscarves or no headscarves in uniform, or everything is great or whatever. But what were the shortcomings on the international side?
Ooh. This program should be about 4 hours long then.
I mean, the mic is yours. Like, feel free.
Okay, thank you very much. I think, what you were talking about with the woman, for instance, who is the deputy in the Ministry of Defense, that's tokenism, right? That's tokenism, and it's, just putting a woman in there because, people want to see a woman in there to say that they've, ticked the box. And that's actually very negative, and the impact is very negative and creates a lot of resentment, and it creates a fantasy for women that, they've actually achieved something they haven't achieved. Because as you can see, then the Taliban come and just take it away really easily. Whereas if you've actually made solid political gains, then God help you, like nobody can take that away from you. And, in terms of, okay, I'm not going to talk about political gains, but, the lady who was the Minister of Public Health, the first Minister of Public Health was a lady, and she was a doctor, and she was a trauma surgeon. I always get her name mixed up with Soraya Sahela. I think it was.
I think it's Sohaila, but don't take me for it. Don't take me for it.
No, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah,
it's I'm getting old and the memory is getting fuzzy. But anyway, so she's a very specific person, and she was a very good trauma surgeon, and she was running the military hospital when the Taliban turned up, and that was hers. She had the skill, she had the authority, she was running that hospital. There was no negotiation about whether she had to wear a burqa or cover her head or do this, that, or the other, or that she was going to be removed and replaced, because the Taliban knew that she knew her stuff and they needed to put their men in that hospital. So they weren't going to argue with her. So that was where, there was a solid gain that nobody could argue with. Similarly, you still see this in the health sector. Female doctors are needed in lots of different fields. The ones who, specialize in specific, who are very good at what they do. There's no way that the Taliban can replace these people, and they're not going to fight them. They own that territory, yeah? So putting in this whole bunch of, very artificial positions and putting people in artificially and saying, oh yeah, these people are this, that, or the other, it's artificial. So of course, like any group that turns up can take these positions away from them. But when they own it, nobody's going to be able to take it away from them. And so, in terms of that, like I would say that the mistake from the donor community was to accept a lot of, at the moment people are talking about greenwashing. Have you heard this term?
Yes.
Greenwashing. So it was almost like women washing everything, just putting women in and then sort of, like, oh, look, this person, and then almost making up a whole sort of profile for these ladies and putting them in these difficult positions, and then, sort of trying to make out that they were doing really well. A lot of them were struggling. It was very difficult. They were put in very difficult positions, and and then everybody had to pretend that it was all going really swimmingly, and it wasn't always. It was very, very difficult for these women. That was one set of mistakes. The other thing was short-termism. Like people would turn up, they already didn't know Afghanistan. They would turn up, they didn't speak any of the languages, and towards the end, they couldn't even leave their compounds. So they were trying to run projects in Afghanistan without knowing what Afghanistan was, what was going on, and not being able to leave their compounds, and just relying on the Afghans that they'd employed to tell them what was going on outside, and whether it was good or bad or right or wrong. And then, a lot of programming decisions were made like this as well. And you tell me, what you think about this, but I would argue that, for example, a lot of the young technocratic types who were surrounding the president towards the technocrats, who were surrounding the president towards the end, had no idea about the reality of rural areas, poor communities, life in certain places. You know, they had a very cloistered and very nice elite life, which is wonderful. You know, they deserve it, whatever. But
Did they really
were,
deserve it?
I have no idea. I mean, you tell me. You tell me. You know, but no experience of the stuff that they were sort of designing policies and programs and writing lots of glossy reports about. And, you know, this was previously we were talking, and, you know, I remember my colleagues from the 90s who were very much in the field with the communities, understood what the communities were going through, and, you know, very, very sympathetic and really sort of like heartfelt service to communities, you know. And this, I can tell you, just disappeared and died. You know, I did not see people with that level of commitment.
But why would you say that is? Why did that happen?
The aid community really changed. I mean, you know, like, for instance, when I went there, it was a given that we all lived and worked in field offices together. So the expats, the Afghans, we all sat down together. We all had naan, you know, we all had chai sabs together. We all sort of, you know, and we were talking, we were experiencing everything together. It was great. But, you know, everything became separated. People were sort of, I don't know, like, the expectations changed. It became more and more bureaucratic. So it was more and more about desk jobs, and people were just coming to the office and going home. It was like working at a bank or whatever. And, you know, the expectation was just that you'd get your salary, you would write lots of documents for a donor, and it was all, you know, more and more about what you wrote on paper. So this imaginary country that was happening on paper rather than being in the reality on the ground.
What was the relationship of because you're talking about sort of the imaginary sort of thing, but this isn't something that's restricted to government. You've also got this cohort, let's say, of activists, right? And I use that word with the quote marks on each side of it. So you've got these activists who are not necessarily in government, but they tend to say a lot of the things that legitimize sort of the government's raison d'être, right? Which is with regard to women's rights and progress and whatever. Some of these activists are politicians, then they come out. Right now we've got a number that, let's say, have fled the country or in the diaspora and are sort of portraying themselves as sort of champions of democracy, human rights, women's rights. What was the approach to these sorts of people? Because they're obviously, they occupy a very sort of, especially in the media, they're very prominent, right? And that you've got all of these foundations and whatever. Were they recipients of aid or of sort of any sorts of favors from the internationals?
Okay, this got very complicated. I would say yes, they were. I mean, you know, like, very much particularly in the women's sphere of things. Like back in the day, like in the 90s, especially towards the end of the 90s, you had umbrella funding type programs. So one big foreign NGO would receive the donor funding, and they would then give it to smaller Afghan NGOs, which were at that time developing. So some women's NGOs started in that period. They were very small, and we're talking about chicken projects, you know, sewing bags, carpet weaving, stuff like that. So they started doing stuff like that. And, you know, suddenly when there was like vast amounts of funding, these NGOs, some of them like expanded very fast and started doing all sorts of activities, including all these, you know, sorts of activist type things. And then a lot of other small NGOs just disappeared. They just mushroomed all over the place. And then later, it became very clear that you had to have a personality to attract funding. So that meant you had to become the darling of the donor circuits, you had to be invited to the events. And to do that, you had to speak English, you had to be personable, you had to be friends with people, and you had to, of course, say things that were of interest so that people would continuously invite you to come back and say those things again. And
I've got someone in mind right now.
Don't say it. Don't say it. Don't go there. Don't go there.
Okay.
So,
it's just as you were talking, it was like a drawing was being made in my head, and I've got the person in my mind. But yeah, anyways, sorry about that.
Okay, no, that's fine. So, and then now lately, it's become fashionable not only to be the personality who says those correct things, who then gets invited, but you have to have been attacked by the Taliban at least once. Otherwise, who are you? You're not important. You need to be attacked by the Taliban at least once, so that you can say, I'm that important, think about it. Just think about it for 2 minutes, right? UK government, okay? UK government has got a lot of possibilities and technology. They couldn't roll out these sort of various COVID apps and to collect information about who was doing what and who was sick and who wasn't, right? Okay. Taliban in the back end of Beyond in Afghanistan apparently are so numerous and so savvy that they're following all these individual women. Maybe they should come and run the UK COVID show. Because every single woman coming out of Afghanistan has been chased by the Taliban, and I'm thinking, these guys are not fighting, they're just chasing women around.
Yeah.
Who is actually doing the fighting?
It also reminds me, there was I don't know if you remember, I don't know if you know the footballer Messi, but there was the picture of a child wearing like a plastic bag with Messi written on the back, and obviously it got everyone sort of, it was sort of heartfelt, everyone sympathized until the family started claiming that he was being threatened by the Taliban.
Oh my goodness.
And I think the Taliban actually replied, like, why would we attack a little, like, we're fighting a war, like, why are we going to attack a boy for a messy plastic bag t-shirt? So but I think the main tragedy here is that whilst these things happened under the guise of human rights, women's rights, so on and so forth, especially with regard to women's rights, there are actually very needy, poor, in fact, destitute women in Afghanistan that actually do need that help. So I don't want people to sort of misrepresent myself or indeed misrepresent you. This isn't sort of a diss track against the donor community trying to help women. There are actually women that really do need that help. But unfortunately, the plight of so many of these women have been hijacked by activist entrepreneurs who, like you said...
Let's call them activist entrepreneurs. So let me just give you an anecdote. So the first time I came across this, I want to call it disease, really. It was 2000, and at this stage I was working for a project which was provision of technical advice for the aid community, like as a whole, on gender issues, because gender was still quite a new thing, technically. People didn't understand how you would include sort of gender issues into programming, right? So I don't know if you want a practical example of that so people know what I'm talking about.
Of course, please.
Okay. So for example, refugees poured across the border from Afghanistan into Pakistan, and they all piled into Jalazai camp, which was an old camp, which was suddenly full of people again. And so a lot of men were doing the assistance in that camp. And what they weren't thinking about was how embarrassed a lot of women from provincial and rural areas are to go to the toilet in front of other people.
Yeah, of course.
So women were literally, I'm not kidding, holding it all day. And then at night would scuttle out. I mean, imagine like not going to the toilet all day and then at night scuttle out and do your thing and come back. So for instance, this was a gender issue, so we had to discuss the location of the toilets, and facilities for women. This was just one issue. So you needed someone with that technical sort of viewpoint to go in and sit with all of these male engineers and say, have you spoken to women? No. So you've put the toilet slap bang in the middle of the camp. This is not going to work for them. At the same time, you can't put it somewhere where you endanger them because it's dark and it's at the edge of the camp and anything can happen. So you have to take these things into consideration. You have to put it in the right place. You have to talk to them. You have to put lighting. You have to all sorts of things, factors. So that was just one issue. But anyway, so I was working on this technical advisory project, and I was working for a US based NGO. And then you'd get this request, and it was literally the most weird thing for me, having worked very practically. These women were like, we need some Afghan women. And I was thinking, by the kilo? I mean, what are we talking about here? And they're like, well, no, they need to come and receive a prize. And I was like, okay, so you just want me to randomly find some Afghan women for you to receive prizes, and it was just this ritualistic, weird thing. And I said, okay, so I know some really great women. These women, do they speak English? No. Okay, then we don't want them. So it's just really like...
Because those women are not marketable, you see, so it has to be someone that's marketable.
And it was such a sad thing for me, like when I think about women's activists, like at one stage, 2004, I was up in Faryab, I was doing an evaluation for a donor of a project. I met a woman, and this woman her husband had died, and then her family, of course, wanted her to marry his brother.
Yeah.
And she'd refused. She just refused. So what happened to her? She got a rifle butt in the jaw. Right? They broke her jaw with the rifle butt. It healed, but after this, she made it her business to make sure that this experience didn't happen to any other girl in that village. And she was teaching literacy for this project, and she was also working on this issue. She wasn't literate. She certainly didn't speak English. This woman was amazing, but she wasn't going to get anywhere in these kind of circuits. Because I don't know, I mean, I suppose these circuits have a sort of logic or a reason. They must exist for a reason. I still haven't figured out what it is, but anyway. Or like, when was it? 2014, I went to Lalusar Jangal in, like it's between it's Dekundi or sort of area. And there was a midwife, and, like, I was watching a distribution of school materials to kids in the mosque. I was there for looking at, sort of a rural development project. And there was this midwife, and she knew every single child in that mosque by name. And, she was there, she was helping with handing out these education materials. Why? Because every single child had arrived in her hands. Mm-hmm. Right? Now, how amazing is that? Right? Every single child in that community for a certain period had arrived in this woman's hand. She was the person who welcomed them into the world, right? Mm-hmm. That's pretty amazing. But she, and she didn't want to be photographed. She said, I'm ugly, I don't have any teeth, don't take my photo. And of course, like, she was never going to get on the sort of, I don't know, cover of some magazine or whatever, or be acknowledged as someone who is doing amazing things for the women and children in her community. But there are women like that out there, and they're very poor, and they're very marginalized, and they're at risk from different, things. And I just feel like, we just failed those women. And I just want to know, the people who say, oh, I'm an activist and I'm doing this. And I want to know, well, how do you link up to that woman, or the one who had the rifle butt in her face? How do you link up to these women? What do you do for them? What happens? So, yeah, I've got a lot of questions myself. So,
I mean, there was one. So I actually did a bit of my own sort of research before we came on the show today, And
Yeah.
so you wrote an article for The Guardian on the 22nd of August
Yeah.
2021, which is exactly a week after Kabul fell to or was liberated by the Taliban, depending, of course, on your political persuasion, either or. But so your article was talking essentially about Farkhunde, who, I certainly remember you, obviously, in your article, you wrote, I think it started off, I am thinking about Farkhunde. That was the first sentence, right? Who was a woman in Kabul, a religious woman, who was killed by a mob because she criticized someone who made his living from selling amulets and was accused of burning the Quran, and who was killed by a mob. But you wrote, and this was a passage that I found really striking and I wanted to ask you about. You said, quote, "More disturbingly, it should also tell us that even in the new Afghanistan, there remained a troubling undercurrent of misogyny in some quarters of society. On that day, Afghan security forces stood by and watched as people tried to rip the young woman apart. I suspect the frustration of decades of being told to grudgingly accept women's rights in public was unleashed on one small crumpled body." End quote. Can you explain what do you mean by saying the frustration of decades of being told to accept women's rights in public? Why is that? Because I obviously, but it could be argued, why is that a bad thing, right? So that was the one passage that sort of jumped up at me, and I wanted to ask you it right now. How would you explain what you meant by that?
Okay, that's a really excellent question, and thank you for asking that question. I was just writing about this with somebody this afternoon. So, Edward Said, Orientalism. Are you familiar with Orientalism?
Who isn't?
Some people, seriously. Imaginary geographies, imagined geographies. So imagining a space that doesn't actually necessarily exist, right? Or exposure to a space where certain things happen. Now, I'm thinking about spaces where people are trained or exposed to the idea of women's rights, gender equality, human rights, etc. There is an assumption that everybody in Afghanistan has been exposed to this and accepts it. This assumption is false. And some people are given a garbled or distorted version of what these things are by their leaders or people that they look up to or mentors. Yeah. For whatever reason, those people will distort it, or they will provide a very negative version of what this thing is. And in a way, a lot of people in Afghanistan, difficult to say what percentage, probably perceive these things as Western imports, which have nothing to do with Afghan culture, which are against Islamic culture, which are immoral. This is not morality, this is immoral. There was a period when, as soon as you went into a village and you said, "I've come to talk about gender issues," or "I want to talk with your women," the men would say, "You're going to make all of our wives divorce us." I kid you not. The number of men who said to me, "You want to make my wife divorce me." So this is what I was talking about. And in terms of misunderstanding, I'm going to tell you a little story if I have time.
Please go. Take all the time you need. I like stories personally, and I'm sure
you like stories.
Everyone else would appreciate a story as well.
So this is a story about bizarre misunderstanding with the community. So in 1996, I was working with a medical NGO in Badakhshan. And I wasn't involved with the program design because I was the administrator and the logistician at this stage. But, there were some very well-meaning Western people who designed this mother and child health survey. They wanted to understand about malnutrition. They wanted to understand about vaccination status. They wanted to understand about maternal mortality and infant mortality. So they had this questionnaire. And then they set up a survey in Baharak district, and they were sending young women out to villages with these survey forms to talk to people. And they had big wooden board, a flat wooden board, and you would put the child on it and measure the height. And then there was a sort of like a thick stick, and you would hang some plastic knickers from it, and you'd put the child in and you'd weigh the child. So then you'd understand if children were malnourished or not. So this was, so these girls were carrying these big boards and these wooden poles around, and they were doing this. So I was, like not involved with the survey, but then at one stage, the medical staff were on leave or whatever, and they said, could you continue the survey? And I said, yes, sure, no problem. So I turned up in Baharak, and then the Afghan girls were there, and they were all in a panic, and they said, the mullahs have stopped our survey. And I said, wow, okay, why did the mullahs stop your survey? Now get this. People had decided that with the questions and the board and the poll, these people were magicians who were bringing dead children back to life with jadoo.
I see. For those that don't know, jadoo is magic. So. And
they were saying that they were calling arwah, like the ghosts and evil spirits, jinniyat and arwah. They were. So the survey was shut down completely. And the girls were actually like in a difficult position because the mullahs were very unhappy. So of course, I went to see the big honcho mullah, the chief mullah in Baharak, and I said, hello, let's sit down, have a cup of tea. He was a bit grumpy at first, and I said, look, can you read? And he said, no. And I said, okay, do you want me to read these survey questions out to you and explain them to you one by one? He said, yes, that would be lovely. So that's what I did. So we spent a wonderful evening with me reading each question out to him and explaining to him and saying, this is why we asked this question. So left unexplained, if I had just had a bad reaction and gone straight off, like nowadays you can do that. You can tweet, I am being threatened by the mullahs in Baharak and they're going to kill me and all of my surveyors and, blah, blah, blah. Then we would have had a really bad escalation and a situation and misogyny. These foreigners coming in with these weird things, activities that they want to do with our young women. But the simple act of going and having a discussion and explaining, which they should have done. They should have gone to these guys and explained to them and found out if they'd actually read the survey forms and that they fully understood what the surveys were about. So we did that. And after that, we had assistance of all the mullahs from the different villages. So, I think a lot of people misunderstood and probably still misunderstand women's rights and gender equality, human rights, etc., etc. They think it's something very, very negative. So that's what I was talking about in that article.
Yeah, definitely. I would concur with those, and it comes back to the point I was making about there actually being downtrodden people, women foremost amongst them, that do really need help, right? Especially right now with this, with the humanitarian situation, but their plights being hijacked by what we agreed are activist entrepreneurs. And similarly, sort of when I sort of look at the discussions that I had with regard to Afghanistan right now, it's we need a democracy, we need women's rights, we need this, we need that. And I'm like, yeah, that sounds good in theory, but the last 20 years were justified to the common people as being exactly that. So a large sort of a bulk of the sort of the Afghan sort of common person now looks at ideas like democracy, women's rights as, like you said, Western imports that they basically experimented for the last 20 years. And I've on Twitter, we have this feature called Spaces, right, where it's sort of like it's almost like you enter a room and there's a discussion and there's a host, and the host appoints a co-host, and there are speakers and listeners and so on and so forth. So I've obviously attended quite a few of these different spaces, of course amongst them the ones of the Taliban, or at least their supporters. I don't know if they're sort of, and every single time the topic of women's rights is brought up, the first response is, yeah, we had women's rights, and what was going on in the presidential palace? Those are the kinds of women's rights you want. Yeah, we don't want that. We're Muslims. We want an Islamic system where everyone will be given their right as according to Islam. That women's rights stuff, we don't want it anymore. And so it comes back to the point as to how much these concepts are now just sort of seen with so much toxicity, because there's a massive discrepancy between the ideal that's being explained to these donors in these fancy conferences where everyone sits down in these neatly arranged chairs, and the activist entrepreneur, gives a brilliant speech in English, but what actually is implemented on the ground in Afghanistan is starkly different. And I believe you said you had your questions.
Yeah, I mean, like one of the big queries for me, it's a sort of a multi-part question. Yeah. So what I've noticed is that you will mention person X, male or female, and this person might be somebody who's quite important or somebody who's in the media spotlight. You say person X, and immediately you get, sort of an array of voices, Afghan voices saying he is a servant of the Germans, or he's a servant of the, I don't know, Italians or the Americans or whatever, or he was bought by the Pakistanis, and his family are all, like they used to be my chowkidar, and then they became really rich during the war with the gun, and they're uneducated, they're terrible people, and they've done all these evil things. And then you see them together at a get-together, and they are so respectful to these people. Or right now, lots of activists have left, and people will write in messages to each other, oh, this person is so corrupt and was so useless, and da, da, da. And yet they give them the Maidan, like the arena, to make very big claims about how important they were, what an activist they were, how their work was critical for, keep holding the entire Afghan state up and afloat. Why is it that Afghans do not challenge these people openly? Is it something cultural? Is it?
I would say just the general apprehensiveness about being rude.
Okay.
But I've generally encountered that myself. People that were like essentially in the 2015-16 sort of period, like really pro Ashraf Ghani, like almost to the extent of being his spokespeople on Twitter. And it's almost like, especially with how the notoriety that Ashraf Ghani gained with hiring the young diaspora technocrat, and then just the sudden sort of 180. I even remember, for example, it's not exactly the same, but they are sort of analogous. Like after the collapse of the Ghani regime, a lot of people came out and said, yeah, I saw this and I saw that, and this was so bad and whatever. But you were serving in it, right? And thankfully, as far as I can see, people on Twitter, I mean, maybe because it's the internet, so they don't have to challenge them face to face, but people on Twitter are saying, wait, but you were part of that regime, like you were cool with that. But I think there's just generally, I think on the part of the person who criticizes and then does, as we say, charpalosi, I think there's always sort of a material benefit that they're hoping to gain by doing so. And I think the reason people don't sort of challenge them is just it's seen as bad manners. I don't know, maybe they also harbor the same sorts of ambitions of, if he gets in, then maybe I can get in. But there are loads of sort of aspects as to why this happens. There's also the flip side of the coin, in which we mentioned person X. Now let's mention person Y, right? Where person Y is being held up in international media as just being the embodiment of everything good and holy in the world, whereas within sort of Afghanistan, everyone knows their dirty laundry. Everyone knows exactly who they are, where they come from, what their family get up to, but no one is willing to challenge in front of the internationals, because you'll obviously get a lot of criticism, but how dare you? He or she is a staunch activist and a defender of XYZ rights, and you're just a Taliban sympathizer if you dare disagree with him or her. So that is unfortunately something that we've come to have to experience, and it goes back to, like you said, one of the main failures that you diagnosed with the aid or the donor sort of mentality was the tokenism that was endemic to it.
Yeah, that's all very good responses, but I feel that one of the failures of what happened in Afghanistan was the lack of willingness of Afghans to come forward and explain this to foreigners who perhaps didn't understand who these people were, and who still don't understand who these people are. They feel that if someone comes out and says, I am the foremost activist, I was the first person from Afghanistan to land on the moon, and on Sundays I generally walk on water, they believe it. They're like, okay, there's no reason for me not to believe it, you know, unless somebody comes out and says.
But I think there's also the aspect of a lot of these people come from families or backgrounds that are essentially criminal syndicates, where they do intimidate, often lethally, sort of their political. So there is that aspect to it, and I think there's sort of that person is very influential and high up and in contact with the internationals. I'm just a poor nobody. Like, why would I sort of want to do that? So I think there is that aspect to it as well.
It's beginning to sound like Bohemian Rhapsody. I'm just a poor boy from a poor family. Yeah.
Ma bechara chi konam.
Yes, exactly, bichara. So yeah, but it becomes problematic because then, you know, it's a reinforcing mechanism. Those people continue to get the exposure, the prizes, the kind of going and talking, building a narrative which is completely false. And you know, the other thing, which is a tremendous weakness, unfortunately, is lack of analysis. A lot of these people have zero analysis, zero analytical skills, and they just come out with this picture that's completely fake, or just like badly analyzed, badly thought through. But because they're Afghan, the assumption is that they understand Afghanistan very well. And so then donors follow these people, and then mistakes are made. And then, you know, the general idea then is that aid failed. But, you know, many things, factors contribute.
So how would you phrase it? Aid did not fail, right, according to yourself?
I would say that, you know, sort of the aid industry has got a lot of problems. Yeah. And I think that there are challenges which are now being faced all over the world. I think that we've come into a new era in many different ways. We've come into an era of environmental crisis, as everybody's been talking about recently. We've come into
know
an
about
era
it in Scotland.
Absolutely, yes, just down the road. An era of, you know, mass movement, migration, people leaving because, you know, where they are, it's not economically feasible, or it's not politically feasible, or it's actually physically insecure for them to be there. So, you know, I don't think that what was conceived back in the day, the sort of development or humanitarian assistance, etc., I don't think that such tremendous challenges were perceived. You know, recently we've had COVID as well, which complicated issues even more. And then, you know, we're in the era of fake news as well. We're in the era of extremism, terrorism. There's a lot to tackle which wasn't there, you know, when initially you had the idea that there's the lesser developed world and the more developed world, and this world will help that world. The boundaries are so blurred, everything is all over the place, and I think that lots of challenges are being faced, and you know, the whole system, I think, has to be stripped down and reworked.
Would you not say, right, and I think I'm going to end it with this question, which I'll pose to you, and I want you to answer, right? Would you not say, given that the aim was in 2001, we're gonna basically invade this country, occupy it, put in place a government, flush it essentially with aid, reconstruction, all of these things, so it can become a stable political order with an economy. Yes, it won't become Singapore overnight, but an economy that can sort of, to some extent, sustain itself, provide some modicum of livelihoods for its people, and have somewhat an economic fiscal base for that political order to be able to stand on, right? That was seen as being too ambitious. It wasn't sort of to turn Afghanistan into Singapore, but that failed, right? Like, even before the Americans left, right? Which is shocking, because we look at, let's say, Najibullah's government, and we're like, yeah, it collapsed 3 years after the Russians left. Ashraf Ghani's regime collapsed as the Americans were before they'd left. The Americans went to the Taliban like, okay, please give us Kabul airport so we can evacuate. We want to be out of here. In terms of a stable political order, it failed. In terms of, and of course, NGOs, consultancies, all of the aid industry, as we know it, was supposed to sort of be the supply side to this, the soft side compared to the military power, contrasted with the military power. All of those things aside, would you not just say that this is, and now we have this looming humanitarian crisis it's not looming, it's unfolding, right? Would you not say it was a failure? Is that still too harsh in your opinion, based on the aims that were held at the beginning?
Yeah, because I think that the missing factor, here's how I see, what unfolded. For sure, the army, kind of fell. But the linchpin in this situation was a situation of panic, which was set up through fake news in the media. All focus went to Kabul airport, right? Mm-hmm. And the crisis in Kabul airport, which for me was very much an artificially manufactured crisis. I don't know who manufactured this crisis for what, but people became very panicked. And it was like this crisis, which, everyone just ignored the rest of Kabul even, like what was happening
in Kabul. Let alone the rest of the country.
Let alone the rest of the country. And it was just like, oh my God, like 2.5 people in Kabul airport. Let's just focus on that. Let's save all those people in Kabul airport. From what? Again, like, yes, sure, some of them were definitely on a hit list, the military guys, yeah, but, it was pandemonium and nobody seemed to be able to control it. And I have to say, from my previous experience with the Taliban, these guys are masters of crowd control, and they just stood back. They just stood back and watched all these people, milling around and having a massive crisis. Of course, okay, I don't want people to jump down my throat and say people were definitely threatened. Okay, lots of people were threatened and they had to get out of the country. Many people were not. It was a big mishmash. And of course, lots of people jumped in to try and make money from the situation and started charging unfeasible fees to get people. But the headache, the pain in the ass, the virus that existed was the media and social media, which bigged this thing up so that all governments, all sort of people were having a knee-jerk reaction, not to what was happening in Afghanistan, but what was happening in Kabul airport, right? So let's shut down all the financial systems. Let's shut down this. Let's shut down that. Let's shut everything down because of Kabul airport, right? So if Kabul airport hadn't happened, right, Taliban rolled in. Yeah, they closed girls' schools for a while. Do you think that, there would have been such a massive knee-jerk reaction to everything and this bizarre series of events that unfolded?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that there is sort of an aspect of a media sort of bias here, it's almost, and you're seeing it. You're seeing it with the coverage now as well, and this isn't to say
it was a feeding frenzy.
Exactly.
Seriously, David Attenborough should have been doing the sorts of
But
feeding
I
frenzy.
think the motive for it is really clear now. Like you mentioned the closure of the girls' schools, right? And like,
Yeah.
here's the thing. It's that I personally think it's the dumbest thing to do, because when you like 25 years, right? It's just been girls' schools, girls' schools, girls' schools, girls' schools. They'd barely come into Kabul, and the media are like, but what about the girls' schools and what about the girls' schools, right? So, and in a lot of these schools, like the girls only schools were closed as well. But there was no sort of Islamic problem with segregation there, right? So, and I've even tweeted about it, and I don't really tweet much about sort of the usual sort of criticisms, but there is obviously the inclination within international media to basically say, look, they did really need us all along, right? Now that we left, right? Look at what's happening in Kabul airport. These people are like, this is what was needed. We needed to be there. Now, if I'm sure you saw the CNN fake news, and it has been confirmed to be staged wedding video of a girl just being given to her.
Yeah, that was so staged.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's been confirmed to be staged.
It was very clear.
So
yeah.
When we look at all the way from Kabul airport to the staged fake wedding, right, which I can't believe, I'm like, it was genuinely staged and fake. I'm saying that on the record. The motive is very clear to say, well, and once again, coming back to Orientalism, Edward said, look, that these savages needed us all along. Right? We were there for a reason. So I think that is essentially what it boils down to. And there were rumors that circulated across Kabul, where if you just managed to get yourself on a plane, you were out and you were going to America. You wouldn't know the Taliban. You'd have an excellent standard of living. And people have been fleeing from Afghanistan, even in Ashraf Ghani's presidency. I remember he was interviewed by none other than Yalda Hakim, who he basically told, I have no sympathy with these migrants drowning because they left and they broke the social contract and whatever. But this is essentially what I would say is the media's sort of bias to basically portray events in one way, to essentially say they needed us after all, right? And but
what I'm saying is that this media feeding frenzy at Kabul airport, Marines holding babies, people throwing babies over the walls. I mean, just this ridiculous shenanigans at Kabul airport, and just captured a lot of people's attentions. And I think there has been a lot of knee-jerk reacting to that. Plus, as you say, a build-up of 20 years or more than 20 years. Let's say from 1996, they took Kabul, 25 years of narrative building of, we had to do everything in secret because of the Taliban. The Taliban stopped me having a dog. The Taliban stopped me playing chess. The Taliban stopped me doing this. The Taliban were so busy that every single member of Afghanistan had a Talib watching over them who stopped them doing something. So that they then had to come out into Europe and do that thing that they desperately wanted to do, that the Taliban were stopping them doing. So the Taliban have been very busy, is all I can say, with every single member of the Afghan population, stopping them doing something in particular that they desperately wanted to do. In a way, people should thank the Taliban for helping them see all their passions that they desperately wanted to do, and helping them sort of push back and create these amazing identities as fighters. So because everybody fought the Taliban on some level and came out triumphant and victorious, therefore, you have to thank the Taliban for being that evil force, that crucible that then forged your amazing personality where you emerged with wings, So it's a very complex picture of narrative building. So in a way, it's like we say in Iran, I don't know what your equivalent is, we say lulu khorkhore, like the scary thing that children are, your parents tell you stories.
Okay, yeah.
So the Taliban have been lulu khorkhore for like 25 years.
Yeah.
And so when they arrived, everybody was like, oh my God, they're here. And so They didn't have a
Yeah.
chance, you know. The narrative just never, nobody ever fact checked any of these stories forming these narratives. Not a single person fact checked a single story. They just bought all these stories and narratives, number one. They built up and they built up and they built up. I mean, you know, and I'm being facetious. It's ridiculous that the Taliban were so busy checking everybody, you know, like who is playing chess, who is playing football, who is having a school, you know, like how much time did these guys have and how many of them were there,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. But
and
once you've started that procedure, you have to sort of take it to, you can't just stop it at, they stopped me from playing chess and they killed my dog. Like it has to keep escalating. So it has to be, if they killed one man's dog, they tortured the other man's dog and then killed him, and then they killed the cats, and it keeps having to escalate until, for example, this daughter being sold thing. So like you said, it's 25 years of narrative building. I had some relatives that I spoke to on the day and just like, oh, they're just pretty normal, you know. I'm a bit nervous about what's going to happen, but so far they're not as bad as we were told. And I was like, yeah, you know. But these were the relatives of mine who hadn't really stepped out of Kabul in like the last 20 years, whereas the others, obviously in the countryside, they were dealing with the Taliban for God knows how long. You had to deal with them if you didn't want to get hurt. So and now it's sort of like, it's like the Daesh, the ISIS thing you mentioned, where just on the 14th of August 2021, for large sections of the global media, it was inconvenient to point out the distinction between the Taliban and Daesh. For large parts of the global audience, they were one and the same. And now the rhetoric has sort of shifted where, oh, okay, we have to acknowledge now that these guys are human, they're somewhat normal, they don't go around eating babies for breakfast, they're not the best, but now we have to sort of juxtapose them with Daesh, right? And that is the classic example. It's sort of like overnight you saw that they now had to humanize grudgingly the Taliban in order to castigate Daesh.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and you're absolutely spot on. But you know, just to go back to the, you know, Najib, it took 3 years to collapse. AFGHANEYE, it took sort of minutes to collapse. It was collapsed by a media frenzy, you know. And I think that it's, you know, considering the role that social media and the media had, and social media, you know, like I can't remember the name of that actress who's escaped, you know, got to the airport and left. And now she's, you know, and I remember the tweets coming out and they were all over social media. I am safe. I left. You know, and there was a lot of stuff like that. I'm safe. I left. I made it. Darlings, I'm safe. And, you know, it's kind of, there was a media frenzy. And of course, I think it would be difficult not to respond to that and to say, oh my God, shut everything down, shut the country down, you know, turn off the power, you know, definitely. Like, so I think that the media actually, and social media, and all of these blessed activists who are running around saying, you know, nuke the Taliban, pretty much as you were telling me, are responsible for this, you know. And I don't see anyone, I see lots of people saying the Taliban must not forget women, don't forget women, women need their jobs back in government. I don't see a single one of those people saying, please unfreeze the funds so that women and children don't die this winter. I don't see that from any of these activists.
There's also the not so amusing irony as to, if you want women to work in the government, they're probably going to need salaries. And those salaries, the money needs to come from somewhere. And that money is frozen because there's no fiscal base for the state to actually pay its civil servants. But in any case, I think we covered a lot of ground. In fact, I'd actually love to have you on going forward as well, because of, you know, aid and the funds and this situation we've got, economic crisis, you know, threats of starvation and famine. So there's a lot to discuss going forward as well with respect to aid and humanitarian work. So I'd love to have you on again, but I think for now we've covered a lot of ground. So thank you for coming on, Sippi. It was actually a pleasure to have you on. And for everyone listening and watching, my apologies about Sippi's audio being a bit itchy. I'll try to fix it up later on, but inshallah the next time she's on, we'll aim to have that resolved as well. So thank you to everyone that watched. And Sippi, if anyone wants to contact you, I don't believe you have a Twitter. So what is the best way to contact you? If anyone
I think the best way is through you guys, just in case people decide to send me hate mail.
I think we're the perfect conduits for that, because we're pretty used to it. But so thank you very much for coming on, Sippi. And for everyone that is watching, please like the video so other people can see it as well. And if it's your first time on our YouTube channel, make sure you subscribe. We've got more content planned. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.